Iran in crisis. What's behind the protests, and will the U.S. attack? That is the subject of our conversation this evening. Hello and welcome to this evening's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Banafsheh Keynoush, international geopolitical consultant, independent scholar of international law, politics, and Middle East studies, and chair of the Middle East member-led forum at Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Tonight, I'll be talking with Dalia Dassa-Kay about the latest political developments in Iran and her new book, which I have right here, Enduring Hostility, The Making of America's Iran Policy. And now, let me tell you a little bit more about our speaker. Dalia Dassa-Kay is a senior fellow at the UCLA Berkel Center for International Relations and director of its Initiative on Regional Security Architectures. She is a former senior political scientist and the director of the Center of Middle East Public Policy at the RAND Corporation. Her new book is Enduring Hostility, as I mentioned, The Making of America's Iran Policy. And so please join me in welcoming Dalia.
Thank you.
Now, Dalia, let me start off by asking you if you can share with us a personal story about what made you write this book, because I know that authors usually have some personal narrative behind a book.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, Banafsheh, thank you for doing this. Thank you for having me here at your great civic club. I'm glad to see people still read books at civic organization, so that's encouraging. And thanks to Dan, who I guess is watching online. So he was ill tonight, but thanks for all the organizing. I think, as I said, and as you, in my introduction, as you said, I, worked at the RAND Corporation for about 15 years. But my entire career, I focused on the Middle East, but I started off focusing more on Arab-Israeli issues. And for many years, I thought, okay, finally, that's getting resolved. In the 90s, I wrote a book, Beyond the Handshake. It was all about, multilateral cooperation in the Middle East. And I thought that was over. And then we have the second Intifada, and I kind of awoke to how difficult these things can be. So when I got to RAND in 2005, this is only in the Middle East context can you say this, I think, but I found it refreshing that they weren't interested in topics on the Arab-Israeli conflict. They were interested in Iran because it was 2 years after the U.S. invasion to oust Saddam Hussein from Iraq. And policymakers at the time didn't really think about, and this is a theme that we're going to get to in this book, really didn't think about what's the aftermath. And sure enough, while they thought, okay, we'll get rid of Saddam Hussein, Iraq is first and Iran will be next. And guess what? Instead of that, the exact opposite happened, and Iran's influence increased in the region. So all of the questions that policymakers were asking in the mid 2005 to 2010, especially when we were really having horrible conflict in Iraq with the occupation of U.S. forces there, everything was about Iran's influence in the region. What do we do about Iran? So I started to spend all this time focusing on Iran. And I want to just say that I'm not a domestic Iran expert like you are. I'm a U.S. foreign policy geopolitical expert on the Middle East. But it's a fascinating country. And I wanted to understand, and I did a lot of reports trying to figure out, what do we do? How do we change things? And when I left RAND and moved on after 15 years, that gave me a chance to step back. I had a fellowship at the Wilson Center where you write books, and I started a book there. And I wanted to kind of sit back and say, instead of all of these policy recommendations we're giving that don't ever seem to be followed, why are we in such a conflictual relationship with this country to begin with? So it was really an effort to try to figure out, how do you overcome adversary relationships? It's been a driving interest of mine of how you overcome conflict. And so I did not realize that the Iran issue would end up being maybe even harder than Arab-Israeli, but they're both very equally challenging. So maybe my next topic will be a little less challenging. But
Thank you for sharing that with us. I mean, it is an enduring hostility. And before I get into the subject of the book, I want to encourage our audience here to write down your questions. You all have cards next to your seats, and one of our colleagues will be collecting your questions. My goal here is to give us at least 20, 25 minutes for the Q&A. I know Iran is a hot topic, as is the United States, and more so the U.S.-Iran relations. So we want to hear your thoughts as well. So Dalia, as you can see, I have a lot of bookmarks as I was going through your book and reading it. I like the title of your introduction, Iran as the ultimate kind of rogue state or rogue. Tell us about it. Why is it the ultimate rogue?
Yeah, I mean, I start the book with this question, why is it that we've overcome these adversarial relationships with very difficult countries, Cuba, even Libya, for goodness sake, even Saddam Hussein's Iraq that I just talked about. The U.S. ended up supporting the Iraq and the Iran-Iraq war, and Iraq was probably as good of a candidate for rogueness as anybody. They used chemical weapons, also, slaughtered their own people and this kind of thing. So I was really interested. That's how I kind of set it up. Why do we have this very difficult situation with Iran now lasting nearly half a century? The U.S.-Iran hostility has now lasted longer than the U.S.-Soviet Cold War. I mean, this is kind of it's an anomaly. And so I go through and I, kind of try to understand this a little bit. And it is a lot about how you talk about a country over time for so long and all of the baggage, because we've done so many horrible things to each other. We both have our sets of grievances. And so what happens, though, and I think in Iran's case, we start with the trauma of the hostage crisis. And I argue that's not enough to explain why it's the ultimate rogue, because it certainly was a trauma. I grew up in that era. I remember yellow ribbons everywhere. It was a psychological trauma to have U.S. diplomats held for 444 days, and to have this, really very, very difficult situation that really the entire country felt. But yet you have in the 80s, you have interest and temptation to deal with the Iranians. So it's not just the hostage crisis. It's not just that they're a repressive regime, which they are. It's not just that they do bad things at home and abroad, which they do. It's the combination of all of those things that other so-called quote unquote rogue states do, but yet they're also an Islamic state. They also have this Islamic identity. So that's the ultimate rogue part. Other states are violate international law. Other states repress their people, but the way American policymakers framed it again and again over the years, mad mullahs, Islamic fanatics, and that discourse continues over now nearly half a decade. And so when you frame a country like that, it starts to get very difficult to say. It kind of closes a space for the options that you can think about to deal with a country. And so we have put them in a category that is somewhat unique, I would say, even compared to other very difficult adversarial states.
Well, it's pretty interesting because I think you're kind of suggesting that Iran being an Islamic state itself creates certain predisposed biases perhaps within American society as well as among policymakers who one would assume represent, a level of elite narratives that are more globally oriented. Why is that the case at this time?
You would think so. And by the way, this is before 9/11, when you really had kind of Islamophobia and this kinds of framings. But I think, one, it was the way, here the U.S. was very close allies with the pre-Islamic Republic, right, with the Shah of Iran, a secular monarchy. And so there was this image of Iran I know some of you were in Iran during that era, women in miniskirts and, freewheeling society and liberal and so forth. And so I think in the mind of a lot of policymakers, but also the public, which affects things, a normal rational state is secular. This was a very traumatic thing because it was these Islamic, this idea that we didn't understand who these people were. And by the way, the U.S. really didn't understand the revolutionaries very well. We had very bad information about who they were, what they were. I know you probably follow that very closely. So I think it's part of that. And it's not everybody. They're very sophisticated policymakers who have lots of nuance. But when it comes to Iran, it's not just the Islamic part, but it's also just how difficult it is because we haven't had diplomatic relations for so long. We don't have an embassy. We don't have diplomats. we don't have a lot of insight into the country, and it's been a real blind spot for policymakers. And I think that combination of being an Islamic state that's also an outlaw, and you have it in other cases, but I think in the case of Iran, with the combination of the hostage trauma, all decade by decade, really traumatic incidents, the bombing of the barracks in the 80s, you have Khobar Towers, you have support for militia groups that kill Americans. So it is this kind of continuous assault. The view is, I'm talking about the perception, not the reality. Of course, we deal with many Islamics. This is why it's it's a puzzle, right? We have many close allies who are Muslim, are Islamic countries. We have no problem. They're not necessarily secular. We're very close with Saudi Arabia, one of our closest partners in the region, not exactly the most stellar human rights record. So this is why it is kind of this puzzle.
It is a puzzle. And, I remember I was a child when the Iranian Revolution happened, and our perception, at least, and Iran is my homeland, our perception of the revolution and of the hostage crisis was that the revolutionaries really didn't quite know what they were doing.
Yeah.
And they just felt disgruntled because of, decades of U.S., I suppose, interventions in domestic Iranian politics that went back decades ago. And of course, the clerics felt, being religiously disposed, that they needed an explanation from the United States that was never forthcoming. But I also want to touch on the enduring side of the question you raised in your book. When I came here as a student in 1997, one of the first questions that our dean asked me, I went to Tufts. He was like, "We're so glad you're here. You're from Iran. You're going to help us fix the Iran-U.S. relations." I'm like just a student. I'm like, well,
it might have been better than what we ended up getting. So yeah.
I said, I don't think so. I don't think that as long as I'm here in the United States, this relation is going to be repaired. And then I thought, you've got a big mouth. You're talking to the dean here. And the dean said, well, why do you say that? I mean, we look at the Soviet-U.S. relations. Iran isn't bigger than the Soviet Union. I mean, we are finally fixing our problems with Russia. And I'm like, there was this nagging feeling. I'm like, I still don't think, based on what I saw in Iran, that it's possible. Now, your narration is very interesting to me because you give us that Islamic perspective of how America views Iran. And then my perspective was that the raison d'etre for the revolution itself was, forgive me for saying this out loud, death to America. So how do you go around and turn that slogan around, and say, well, yeah, long live America? How quickly can that possibly happen in one generation or in one's lifetime? I haven't seen that many times throughout history. And that's why I want to go to the next question, death to America. Dalia, how is that perceived by all these presidents that I've seen since I've been here? It was Clinton and then Bush, and you touch on all of those in detail. We'll get into the details. And then, more and more presidents, and now President Donald Trump. Quickly, very quickly, because I want to go into the details of the book. How do they perceive death to America?
Yeah, well, that's a very general, one of the aspects of my book, it's a story about American policymaking, and it's not just like Iran is not monolithic, that is for sure. American policymakers are not monolithic. There are lots of different camps. They perceive it differently. But yes, the deeply anti-American, anti-Israel, anti-Western ideology of that foundation of the Islamic Republic has been a main bedrock, a main reason why it is very difficult to overcome and deal with Iran like we deal with other countries. That said, the Soviets had a pretty anti-American ideology too, right? They were against our entire foundation, and we got over that. Now, you could argue, well, the Soviets were too strategically important. Now, again, Iran is, at the end of the day, it's a middle power or small power. It wasn't, why are we having this? But it sits on a strategically, as we know, geographically important spot in the world when it comes to oil and so forth. So you could make the argument, and that is how they dealt with it. Yes, they want to kill us, but lots of countries don't like America. I mean, this is in the 70s, Latin America.
I'm not sure they want to kill us.
Yeah, but many, the Americans have experienced this where we've had terrorism, right? So there were people who wanted to kill. The point being is policymakers are also rational. They're looking at what is the U.S. strategic interest, and that's the kind of the perspective I'm taking in the book. And from a U.S. strategic interest perspective, we should be able to not to become friends. We're not going to become allies. Not to stop calling out the human rights abuses, which we did with the Soviet Union, by the way, the entire Cold War. It's not one or the other. This is also often a false dichotomy. But the point is that strategically they're an important country, and this escalation of tensions and hostility is really preventing us from working in areas where we may have in common. And so you do see from Reagan all the way through the administrations, you see a lot of interest, and you see presidents who want to deal with the Iranians because strategically they consider it important to figure out how to finally get over this very bizarre animosity that we have, despite that rhetoric, because there's rhetoric and there's reality. And we see the Iranians at different points pivot. And yet we get back to the same cycle where there's an interest, there's some potential openings, and then we get back to this very escalatory cycle where we're back in direct conflict again.
So again, you raise a very good point, and you are encouraging me to dig deeper. I apologize for giving you a hard time on this, but I will. You're saying on the one hand that they're not monolithic leaders, and we do know that in international relations, leaders are only actually surprisingly a very small part of how the globe operates. Their personalities, and they have their own complicated psychologies, and they all have their buddies and friends, and then the bureaucracy to deal with, and then God knows Iran falls 100th down, as you say in your book as well, not a priority on that list, right? So we do have that issue, but then I like the comparison you make between the Soviet Union and Iran. I would think that the Soviet Union, being a communist state, represented a worldly ideology challenge to the United States of America, whereas Iran, being a Muslim state, predominantly Muslim state, represented what the Iranian revolutionaries always like to boast about. Not a worldly or secular ideology, but an enduring religious and heavily religiously indoctrinated ideology. And they always like to brag about, oh, look at the Soviet Union. They fell, they collapsed because their ideology was worldly. We're not going to collapse. We're going nowhere. And even if you kick us out, this religious ideology, as we know, as in the case of the Taliban, for example, withstands the test of time. Is there any section of your book, Dalia, that kind of tells us if ever this reality has dawned on the American leaders and politicians?
Well, I think, just to get to what you're saying, I mean, I think that, yes, this Islamic foundation is important, but at the end of the day, it's about survival. And usually the survival means we have to be hostile to the West, but sometimes the survival has meant actually we may have to deal with the West and deal with things a little differently. And let's not forget that despite this ideology, you have European embassies, you have European diplomats, you have lots of engagement. So I think, I'm not saying that there isn't a fundamental religious aspect to it, but there are, I think, and you are more of the domestic Iran, and I'm dealing, more with how we're responding. But, there are leaders in Iran over the years. Now, in the last few weeks, I think we've probably crossed the red line. But there have been leaders, even the supreme leader, who's the most fundamentalist and rigid, who, for the sake of survival, because as you say, they're very good at that, they can be pragmatic. And I think we should get into some examples here, because if we're just painting this Islamic fanatics, and I'm using this quote unquote Islamic, these are words that if you look at congressional debates, if you look at discourse, if you look at American newspapers, how Iran is discussed, we always call it a regime, not a government, partly because it is it's a system, right? They themselves call themselves a system. But the way we frame it, but if you look at what has happened, even in the 1980s, the trauma of the hostage crisis, the mad mullahs who took our hostages and so forth, you have the NSC advisor of Ronald Reagan sent to Tehran. I mean, this is like unthinkable things today, although right now I think anything may be thinkable. But you had, he was sent on a mission to find so-called Iranian moderates. So there was a belief that you could deal. And he brought a key-shaped cake to signify the potential opening. He brought Reagan's Bible because they were interested in making sure the Soviets didn't. There were strategic reasons on the U.S. side to deal with them. And they thought that, that maybe that would be more important than this kind of continuing. And in the end of the day, it became a scandal because what did the United States do? For all the talk of the mad mullahs and how much they hate us, the U.S. sold arms to Iran. We sold arms. Direct arms against congressional, first of all, against the arms embargo that Carter had installed after the hostage taking. And it became a scandal. And then it became a politically toxic issue because who wants to deal with Iran? Because then you get exposed. You see it again and again. You see it in the 90s. There was an interest in engaging them because after the Rafsanjani, there was a sense maybe they'd be more pragmatic. Then they were sidelined, as we discussed. But then again, after the 2003 Iraq War, you mentioned the Taliban. The Taliban were a common enemy. So again, we had diplomats dealing directly with the Iranians. The Iranians, these, mad mullahs, quote unquote, were giving the U.S. targeted information about the Taliban. I'm not saying these are good guys. They were doing it for their own interest because the Taliban were a threat to them. They are very good at survival. The point is, from a U.S. national security perspective, there are times when it makes sense to calm tensions with adversaries and start thinking out of the box of how you deal with them, because the way we've been dealing with them for close to 50 years, where it's just isolation, containment, and military pressure, has been very bad for all of us, and certainly been bad for the people of Iran because they're in the worst shape they've ever been in right now. And obviously the Iranian government, their leaders, their failed leadership are a big reason for these failures. But the point of my book is to say we also have to look at ourselves. We have to also look at our policy system. We have to look at why we missed opportunities. What was it about our process that prevented us from having ability to engage or test openings when they might have been possible over time? And then maybe we wouldn't be at 47 years where we're talking about a possibility of another war with Iran in 2026.
Well, I like the way you weave the story of, Iran's Islamic foundation into the national interests. And I want us to come back to the national interest because we've kind of determined that leadership plays a role, but not the whole role. It is the national interest that both the Iranians and the Americans have in mind when they engage or disengage.
Yeah, exactly.
And I really want us to fix this question of enduring hostility by the end of this conversation. I want to actually reverse the process. So let me get a little bit into the details of the book. All right, so what drew me to reading this book, and I encourage you all to do the same, was the look within perspective that you have. You bring to the fore the conversations of American politicians, American policy makers, the wrangling, the bickering, the do we understand Iran or not? Do we prioritize it or not? How do we look for the moderates? When do we buy them cake and fly it all the way? Well, by the way, do you know where they bought that cake from?
No, I don't.
I was a kid. It was always a question for me. Was it made in America, or was it baked in America, or where?
And we'll have to investigate that.
We need to investigate that. But tell us a little bit about the figures, because I found that really interesting. I mean, few of us pay a lot of attention to these details. You talk about American diplomats, you talk about American presidents. Can you give us one or two examples of how they have failed to grasp the reality of Iran, and also an example of their disagreements?
Yeah, I'll give two examples, one on each of those two questions. So one about not having very good understanding, and it's improved since then, but Madeleine Albright talked about it. I had a chance to interview her before she passed, and she also writes about this in her own memoir, but she has a story about when she was in a room negotiating a multilateral setting. Iranians and Americans have been in the same rooms. We could talk about it's in different times, but even in the era of Clinton, there were multilateral meetings on Afghanistan, because even before 9/11 and before the Taliban were ousted, there was lots of common concern about trying to get stability in Afghanistan. So there were these multilateral meetings on Afghanistan run by the UN, and the U.S. diplomats would be in the same room with Iranians, which didn't happen that often. Usually it was a big UN setting, but it's a smaller setting. And Madeleine Albright in President Clinton's second term was very interested in testing whether there could be some opening with Iran. A more moderate Iranian president had been elected in 97. Again, those who really understand the domestic Iran system, I think the consensus is the supreme leader really calls all the shots, but the presidents can still, they can still have room to maneuver. So there was this, this was a time when there was an Iranian president talking about dialogue of civilizations. And so there was kind of a sense that maybe we should test this. And Madeleine Albright was very interested in doing it, and she had a speech where she apologized for the U.S. being part with the Brits of the coup to oust Mossadegh in 53, and that's kind of the original sin on the Iranian side, and it's a big debate. But anyway, so she was very interested. So she's sitting in this meeting, and she was excited because she thought she was going to finally meet the Iranian foreign minister, and because they had never had a chance to engage. This is how little contact that U.S. and Americans and Iranians had. And so she's sitting in the meeting, and she's looking at who she thought was the Iranian foreign minister, and she's thinking, it doesn't look like the picture I thought I had of him. And she passes a note to one of her advisors. She says, "Is that the Iranian foreign minister?" She's like, "We're not sure." And sure enough, the UN convener addresses the Iranian diplomat sitting in the room as Mr. Deputy Foreign Minister. So it was not the foreign minister, and the Iranians were kind of sending a message again saying they also have their own obstacles, right, of how they have been hesitant to engage us for all of these, a variety of reasons. And so they obviously purposely lowered their representation because they didn't want to give Albright give her a bone or whatnot. So it just shows you just the how little transparency we have understanding. Now, it's been corrected since. Condi Rice, actually, in the second Bush administration, was really worried about U.S. diplomats' hands being tied by not really having any presence in the country, not understanding them. And so she actually established they called it kind of a Iran watching office in Dubai. And so there was an effort to increase Iranian knowledge of Iran within the State Department. There were only a handful of people in the State Department who, spoke the language, who knew anything about the country. So it has improved since then, but I wouldn't say it's stellar. There's still a lot of reliance on different channels. So that's one example of one of the problems. And then, the back and forth in our own country, we often talk about Iranian factions. We have our own factions. And so one of my favorite stories in the book is I interviewed at length Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who was ambassador many places, Pakistan, and Iraq, and he also was the victim of Iranian-backed terrorism. He was in the U.S. embassy when it was bombed in the 80s. So he knows what the Iranians are capable of, let's put it that way. But he was one of the first U.S. diplomats since the Iran-Contra dealings of the 80s. He was one of the first U.S. diplomats to deal directly with the Iranians after 9/11. Just months after 9/11, he started going on missions authorized by the president to deal with the Iranians to see could they work together on some post-Taliban situation and where could cooperation be. And he didn't just deal with Iranian foreign ministry diplomats. He dealt with the hardcore IRGC, the guys who really do the killing. And it was pretty productive. I mentioned, they showed maps of, where the Taliban were. There was actually pretty robust communication. But what he talked about was how he had to keep this, even though it wasn't secret. Technically, it was authorized. But he wanted to keep it out of the press, and also that would mean keeping it out of factions in Washington who did not want the U.S. to be engaging the Iranians. So he would talk about how we would fly out on Friday night, get to Geneva or whatever European capital, meet the Iranians, fly back Sunday so he could be back in the office Monday morning and nobody would know what was going on. So I have, a bunch of different stories like that. Jim Dobbins, who I also interview, also dealt with the Iranians in that arena. And he talks about it in his own memoir as well, having shouting matches with the so-called, members of the neocon branch of the administration that were very much the only thing they believed would change Iran was force. And they thought, and these were the people who thought that if you get rid of Iraq, it would be the domino theory that Iran would go next. So, so there were a lot of internal battles. So it was not a monolithic, there are many, many different views. And I want to be, we should be honest about this.
Yeah.
There's no one correct way. It's a very complicated question, right? So I personally don't think military force is the way to go, but you can see why this is such a difficult problem, why the Iranians have caused so much, disruption in the region and globally. You can see why there are big debates about this, because it's very frustrating when you have policies in place for this long and you keep getting the same result, and the result is not good.
Well, you touched up again on some interesting stories there, and you had mentioned earlier that we do suffer from some blind spots, mindful that we don't have diplomatic representation on the ground. If you allow me, I like to kind of unfold, take off the fold. How do you say that? Take off the fold from the eyes and unblinded or something.
Yes.
One of the stories that you just talked about was Mossadegh and the overthrow of Mossadegh. And as you know, that was a democratically elected prime minister who was overthrown by a British-devised CIA coup in Iran that basically overthrew Mossadegh and brought the Shah Reza Pahlavi back to power. And it didn't sit very well inside Iran, because the Shah was having a lot of difficulty unifying the country's different political groups at that time. There were leftist groups, there were the Islamists. But one thing that the coup definitely did was give more voice to the Islamists. And about what that happened in 1953, the Islamic Revolution was in 1979. So do the math, someone please, for me. That's for 3, 6, 3, 7, 3, 8, 3, about 3.5 decades. How many decades later?
47 years.
47 years, thank you. Later, they took over control of the country. And they were saying, well, the 1953 coup, right? I was quite personally a little offended when America apologized to the revolutionaries for the coup. And I was, by then, of course, a U.S. citizen as well. But that wasn't the reason. The reason was that, having grown up in Iran during the revolution, I knew how very little respect these fellows had for Mossadegh.
Yeah.
They didn't like him. Mossadegh, as far as they're concerned, was a vehicle for the Islamists to use as a platform, the coup, a vehicle to use it to then, and come to power. And they immediately sidelined the leftist groups much quicker than the Shah could, because they had a spiritual ideology, a godly ideology. It was much easier to get rid of pro-Soviet ideologies in Iran. I knew that because the main street, they renamed a lot of streets after the revolution. And the biggest street, and my parents' home was close to that, was Shariati. Shariati, an intellectual who died under suspicious circumstances a year before the revolution. And many think that the Shah's secret police may have killed him because of his Islamic opinions. Mossadegh was like, yeah. So I'm like, why should our Secretary of State apologize to a group of people who don't really sufficiently respect Mossadegh, as far as I'm concerned? So there's one blind spot, right? Yeah. There's one blind spot. But I want to go back to the national interest.
Well, and I just want to say, and these are talking points that American officials are getting. It's kind of like, what what would be the kind of the boxes you can check, and that's often one. And the revolution is a very complicated story, obviously, and that is not something. There are many other books written about it, but it is a good point that, and there's a lot of literature since that has kind of suggested it was a more complicated story than people think. But the perception is it was external intervention, and I think, you know, in her defense, I think it was also the idea that you're apologizing to the Iranian people, not that you're, you know, it's just this, but it's just the idea that we intervened. It should be up to you. And there were other things she talked about that rubbed the Islamic leaders the wrong way, because she talked about unelected officials. They didn't like that. And so it goes both ways. We pick at each other's language, and we don't get very far.
Dalia, where did the idea of the cake come from? That was so anti-cultural in the revolutionary to be delivered a piece of cake.
Well, let me just say, I don't have an answer.
Idea behind
I don't have an answer to that. But you're really fixated on that. You want to know the bakery. You want to know the memo.
I never quite got it.
I think what you're getting at is there's a lot of lack of understanding, cultural understanding, and some of that's been corrected because, frankly, now, I mean, the State Department is staffed with people who really are experts who do focus on the country, although without being inside, it's hard. But I think it gets to when you have had no contact for so long, you don't really have a lot of expertise. You make these kind of simple cultural, you know, assumptions that are often, you know, not just that they rub the elected leaders the unelected leaders, as Albright said, but they rub the Iranian people the wrong way. Totally. And as you say, there isn't this hatred of America among the Iranian people. And so that's something that we have to be thinking about constantly. We're pursuing these policies that are backfiring in terms of how the public, you know, how the Iranian people are perceiving.
You'll be surprised. There isn't that much hatred for America among the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps. Yeah. So many of them have talked to me and told me how lucky I am to live in the United States of America. You know, that just goes, I mean, that's just a personal story. But I want to go back to your book.
Economics, they're interested in, and many of their children study in the West and so forth. So yeah.
But I want to just quickly, you know, we're running out of time a little bit, and this book is heavy with details. And I want to just quickly brush over them and then get to unraveling the mystery of the enduring and make it unenduring. Paul, you say policymakers have agency, and now we understand that while they have agency, well, there's still limits to what they can understand, and there's still limits to what they can do. We have established that the national interest is still predominant in defining the U.S.-Iran relations. But surprisingly, in one of your sections of your book, you talk about how the Americans try to view Iran through the prism of national interest and yet have a Cold War mentality, from my understanding of it. They're like, we don't want Iran under the revolutionaries to fall under the Soviet orbit or the Russian orbit. Maybe we should reach out to the moderates in Iran. And here we are in Iran. Heck, no way we're going to fall under the Russian orbit, because the revolutionaries have never been very trusting of Russia. Russia has never been a good neighbor to Iran. So, and I'm reading this, I'm like, what were people in Washington quite thinking? I mean, they also said we overthrew Mossadegh in 1953 because we were worried that Iran would become a Russian orbit. And all those other countries that became a Russian orbit were not Muslim countries. Yeah. I mean, exactly what was America thinking?
And let me just say, there were people in the State Department who pushed back on that, who understood that, again, you know, they had better understanding of the history, that the Iranians and Soviets were no great friends. And to this day, that's the case, right? The Russians didn't exactly come to Iran's defense in June of 25, when the U.S., for the first time in the history of the relationship, attacked on its territory itself. So I think a lot of your questions are getting to this theme of, it seems like crazy that American policymakers could be so misinformed and the assumptions that are driving them. But no, this is how things work. Things are not as rational and smart and strategic as we like to think. Maybe now that's not sounding as far-fetched, but, you know, in the past you would really not. But in the past you would have thought, okay, no, these are really smart people. This is what they do for their living. No, some of the people who came up with Iran-Contra are the same people who cooked up the idea that you would oust Saddam Hussein and that would solve all our problems in the Middle East. Democracy would break out, Iran would be solved, and everything would be, you know,
we'll build more Trump towers in Tehran.
So again, you're getting to similar things, which is there's a lot, and it's not just on Iran, but you see it a lot with the Iran case, a lot of faulty assumptions.
Therefore, and I like it that how you touch on it, but let me just rush through this book. So we get tired of all of that. Because we get tired of ourselves, right? We really don't know what we're doing, right? That's I'm just simplifying what Dalia said through expert language. So then we start using the stick. We're like, well, those rogue bad guys, let's just contain them. And you talk about the policy of dual containment. Let's contain not just Iraq with the bad guys, but also the Iranians. And then here I am in America, and people are like, are you Arab? Are you Persian? Do you speak Arabic? And, is it really like I'm trying to just make sense of this? My head is revolving around, or not revolving, or just moving around what the hell is going on in America with their understanding of my homeland. And so we say contain, and then sanctions. Iran has been under sanctions since 1979, right? And I've talked to people at the White House. I've always told them, I don't believe that sanction is even a policy. Sanction is a policy tool, but where the hell, is the policy, right? What are we doing on the policy? Again, I want to stick, these are lines, dual containment from Dalia's book. I want to go quickly because we're running out of time. Then you talk about the parallel universes, right? And I want you to say a little bit more about that. You say that President Bush comes to office, we've established that the dual containment policy is irritating us. Well, let's just go bomb Iraq, as you say, and then let's figure out what we're going to do with Iran later. In the meantime, let's call Iran an axis of evil. So, every administration comes in and labels Iran something. By the way, I have a cookbook called The Axis of Evil Cookbook. It's filled with delicious Iranian recipes. Highly recommend it. Tell us about this parallel universe from the point of view of American policymakers at that time. What was going on?
Yeah, well, it gets back to kind of the story. I'll make it short because I already told you about the Ryan Crocker story, Ambassador Crocker story. But, Ambassador Crocker, when he's doing these negotiations that were going pretty well, he attributes the axis of evil speech to kind of blowing up the process. That once President Bush used that language, the Iranians lowered, kind of like what they did with Albright to send their message, they lowered the level of their delegations. The decision makers who could kind of call the shots were no longer showing up, and they didn't really get much accomplished after that. So you have these two, camps, probably more than any other administration. In the Bush administration, you really have very prominent neocon camp versus, the diplomatic corps who are interested and so forth. And Condi Rice, I think, is in the more pragmatic camp. You see that in the second administration. And so that's what that's about. And it's about how language really affects things. And that's a big part of the story too. How we use the language again and again. It affects policymakers' perceptions. It affects the realm of what you can think about. And as you say, sanctions, it's not a policy. It's the default tool that we use again and again because we don't want to go to war and we can't engage the mad mullahs because they are horrible. I mean, the book talks about trying to apologize. It talks about all these horrible things they do. Because they're horrible, you have to deal with them and figure out how to stop and have less killing and harm. And so I think that's what that story is about, of the two different worlds that were kind of fighting against each other and the damage. And by the way, I interviewed Steve Hadley also for this and others, and people are not sure how Axis of Evil came into why it got in this.
So you then again, fast forward, let's have a grand bargain. And the interesting thing was that as American policy circles were all writing about the grand bargain, I was talking to people like the presidents in Iran, and they're like, what bargain? They don't even understand the concept of a grand bargain. Just a few people in Iran who have a foot in America were trying to come up with a label. They're like, Americans understand labels. Axis of evil, grand bargain. I mean, seriously, we're talking about two countries that have a whole history that cannot be so easily be rendered into simple labels. And then Obama foreign policy comes around and says, well, okay, I remember one of Obama's aides told me, this Ahmadinejad guy, he's a loose cannon. We need to stop that. So we're going to impose more sanctions, and then finally we're going to get a nuclear deal. And we got the nuclear deal in 2015. And then what happened? President Obama made the nuclear deal knowing that it won't go through Congress at some level. And he still made the deal. Dahlia, what was he thinking?
Well, I think President Obama really wanted an arms control agreement. He wanted to, at this point, because we didn't go over the history of the nuclear, which has been a big sticking point, obviously, in the relationship. And, by that time, Ahmadinejad was no longer the president. You had Rouhani. You had, by the way, Obama came in. He talked about an outstretched hand to the Iranians in the first administration. Nothing really got anywhere until the second administration, when he had fewer political constraints and when you had different thinking on the Iranian side. And what he was thinking is, I want an arms control agreement. The Iranians have gotten too far. We have to figure out a multilateral international way to cap this. He managed to get international. The only way sanctions work, we were dismissing sanctions, but sanctions can be effective when they're international, when you get the entire international community on board, which he did with the UN Security Sanctions Resolution 1929, which even Russia and China agreed to. It put the squeeze on Iran. They were ready to come to the table, and you actually got an agreement. You got the Iranians to, now, again, I think it's often exaggerated what this deal was supposed to do. It was not a transformative agreement. It wasn't going to solve the enduring hostility. It was an arms control agreement. It dealt with one issue, and that was the critique against it, of course. But that's what he was thinking. I want an arms control deal, and I can get it now. I'm in a position to get it, and he got it.
Okay, so that's very interesting. President Trump just basically said, well, we don't want that deal. In 2018, the United States withdrew the U.S. out from the deal, the Biden era. You have a very good title for the Biden era, Death by Slow Walking. We don't know how to revive that nuclear deal, and President Biden got tired of it. And so President Trump came back, and now he wants to, God knows, maybe kidnap the supreme leader or not, or I don't know, take him as he did President Maduro of Venezuela, or land American troops on the ground. But before we go there, and we want to do this in 2 minutes, that is your challenge, Dahlia, we get to your conclusion, which is fascinating. You talk about what's hindering us from moving forward. Can we heal the Trump-caused rifts? He's talking about attacking. If Iran doesn't make a new nuclear deal, and the Iranians will not make that new nuclear deal. Nobody knows what engagement's going to look like, or if we should come up with a new name for that engagement term. Then you talk about politicians in America, each trying to cash in based on which administration they are serving. They try not to criticize each other so that they're seen as team leaders. So innovative thinking on Iran might not always take place. In 2 sentences, Dahlia, what are we looking at?
Okay. Well, I think you read it well. The story is about domestic politics. This is what the story is. Why is it? And Trump is maybe the best example. The title of that chapter, this is his first administration, is the Obamacare foreign policy, because it was all about whatever Obama did, I'm going to do the opposite. But to be fair, it's not just President Trump. It was across administrations. This is why you had slow walking in the Biden administration. Domestic politics make dealing with Iran a very toxic issue. There is no upside to engaging the Iranians in the U.S. political system. Nobody advances their careers. Nobody's getting a Senate confirmation for making a deal with the Iranians. They're a very, very nasty set of leaders. So I think this is the storyline. There's no upside. You have career, you have other incentives in Washington that constantly put impediments in place. And you have the Iranians up to activities that make it very easy to continue that narrative and that position because they continue to do these things that make it very difficult to deal with them. And the last 3 weeks, what's happened over the last month may have crossed a line that we cannot go back to. And so this, even as difficult as it's been, I think now it will be, I would say, nearly impossible. I want to just say, though, the book was not called permanent hostility. So maybe that helps you a little bit with the,
help me rest
it was not called permanent. It was enduring because nothing is ever forever. Nothing lasts forever. So we don't know how it's going to unfold. And you can ask questions, the audience can ask questions, my views of where Trump is heading now. But if you read my book and you read what he did in the first administration, you would not be surprised about what's happening now.
Well, the leadership in Iran is nasty. What it is doing to its people is beyond nasty. Nasty doesn't even begin to define what's happening inside Iran. But I want to go back to the question of national interest. If it's the national interest, what national interest? Is it a mercantilist national interest? Let's do an arms deal. Let's build Trump Towers. Let's take the oil. And as long as we don't have a clear conception of what our national interest toward Iran is, and of course, as you're saying, vice versa, then this enduring title will remain.
Yeah.
But I think that we really have to get to the bottom of understanding that national interest. And to that end, I want to, first of all, thank you very much.
Thank you. Great question.
Thank you again. Yeah. That was remarkable. And thank you to our audience for the questions that you've sent to me. And I'm going to go over them very quickly. We did discuss, there's a question about Prime Minister Mossadegh. Very valid. Do we know how prime ministers come about? Yes, it takes a lot for them to get elected. Mm-hmm. And once they're ousted, it's kind of like, the idea is kind of funny, right? Because they're going to leave anyways. They're not kings, right? Do you have anything to say about that? But I think we have touched about it. Let me just put it all together. There are several questions about whether the CIA was clueless or not. What was it thinking? We talked about that. But just to give you a sense of it, is there anything, just a sentence that you want to, there's again a third question about coup d'etats, because I think it kind of resonates with what President Trump wants to do about Iran right now. I mean, we have a bad leadership in Iran that kills people and disrespects human rights. What is the significance of coup d'etats in this time and age?
Well, I think, it's coming up more now because it gets to your fundamental question of what is the goal? Whether you want to call it national interest, we shouldn't make too much. I actually do think leaders matter. Leaders can frame national interest. The framing and narratives leaders use matter. But I think it's coming up more now because we don't have a very good idea, not just this current president, but all before, of what do we want with Iran? What is our end state? We don't like this regime. Of course, everybody wants the regime gone, but never in U.S. policy have we articulated that as our goal. Until the last month, President Trump's statements got as close as U.S. policy has ever gotten to saying we want this regime to go. He basically called for Iranians, take over your institutions, and so forth. Now, we do want to keep them contained, right? What does that mean, contained? So you have sanctions that end up hurting Iranian people more than their leaders. This is what's happened de facto over the years. But to what end? These are not policies, these are tools. So do we want regime change? Do we want detente? Do we want just to keep the status quo going? And what is the theory of change? We haven't had a theory of change in Iran. How is this supposed to happen that we get a better outcome? We haven't really had good answers for that. And I don't think we have good answers now. In terms of what Trump is trying to do, we don't know because it's not fully articulated. He sends mixed messages. One day he says, go overtake the embassies. Another one he says, they stopped the killing. We're done. Now we're sending an aircraft carrier to the region, among many other military assets. So use of force is absolutely on the table. Traditionally, you're talking about coups. I think historically, we know military force has not brought about more democracies in the targeted country. It's usually brought about more civil strife and repressive outcomes. Now, you could argue it can't get worse than it is right now. And that is a fair argument. You could argue that. But the question is external intervention going to do that? My own view is it's going to have to happen within. And that's why there's a lot of talk about coups right now, because there's a lot of thinking that with all of this pressure internally and externally, that the Iranian leadership is facing, that this may be a movement where you're going to start seeing fracturing among security services, among the leadership. We have not seen it yet, but if you really want the regime to change, you're going to have to see that. Because without that, right now, the IRGC, they might like Americans. They definitely like making money. There's a lot of corruption, but they've put a lot into this system. And if you think if this system goes, I will be dead, I can't trust this idea that I'm going to get safe passage and whatnot, they will fight to the end. So this is a real problem right now. So there's a lot of, people speculating, will there be a coup? Will there be fracturing? We don't have very good insight. The bottom line is we don't know, but that's the kind of speculation happening right now. And then the question is, what role can the U.S. play in facilitating that? I don't think there's been very good thinking, but we know historically these things have not worked out well when it's coming from the outside.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
That is an understatement.
That's very interesting. I mean, one question is has our response been lukewarm? And you said, well, President Trump is anything but lukewarm at the moment. So we do know that. And
what do you mean lukewarm?
Like the response to what just happened in Iran, I think that's what is meant. The international.
Well, he's certainly not the most pro-democracy president we've ever had. Now, you can argue previous presidents, it was just rhetoric and didn't follow through. But President Trump, if democracy, again, we can ask, what is our goal for Iran? I mean, you would hope that the goal would be democracy and rule of law because that's what the Iranian people are looking for. But if that was the goal of this current president, then why would you be deporting 2 plane loads of Iranians trying to get asylum in America back to Iran to face sure persecution? Why do you have a visa ban on Iranians trying to flee the country from getting asylum? These are not, why are you cutting funding to international organizations, NGOs, taking the U.S. out of all kinds of institutions that are trying to promote civil society and democracy and rule of law around the world? If that's your goal, democracy in Iran, then the tools we're using are not very good, which is leading people to believe, does Trump want to do a Venezuela with Iran?
Exactly.
And that would not be a good outcome for the Iranian people, needless to say.
Well, I have to say that, a lot of the questions that we've received from the audience kind of falls very naturally in line with the conversation's flow at this moment. One of the questions was as you mentioned, during the Khatami era, for example, there was an idea of a détente. Could the U.S. have made a more concerted effort at the time to become friends with America, with Iran? Well, I think you touched on the impediments there. I remember, I was actually translating for Khatami. I was his interpreter when he came to right after 9/11, and he wanted to go visit the 9/11 site. And I don't know whether it was the mayor of New York or whether it was the State Department. They didn't give him permission to leave beyond like a mile, or said, no, you can't go to the site of just to go pray for it. We don't want you there. So that is a non-starter, right? Let the guy go and read his prayers for 9/11. I was walking by that building a little later and I saw I don't know when, it was a summer. I had family in New York, American family in New York, and we saw a group of Afghan people who looked like the Taliban to me, actually were standing there and praying before that site. So, there's these little glitches that can be kind of smoothed over, but we lost those moments of history. I think you would agree with me, right?
We did. There were a lot of missed opportunities, just to answer that question, and they came from both sides. So again, this book isn't just saying it's all of our fault. Obviously, the Iranians play a big role. I wrote the book because I think the Iran part of the story is more well known. We know that, the difficult leaders and the difficult things that they have done, but we're less willing, and there's been less written and focused about our own blind spots, our own impediments to thinking differently, because we keep having the same menu again and again, and we're not getting good outcomes.
And Israel doesn't make it easy. And I am, that would be a whole nother invitation.
Well, I deal with Israel a lot in the book, actually. Yeah.
You do, and you do mention it, which it's a big factor now, right? It's
Absolutely.
A big factor because Israel also has a lobby in the United States. Iran does not have a lobby in the United States. But that said, I also have to say that Israel is important to us. Israel matters. Despite everything that we've all witnessed over Gaza, Israel is a country in the Middle East that matters. So I suggest we invite you back for a conversation between the two of us on Israel. We will do that, I promise you. But I want to finish these questions. It's about the idea of a coup and whether it will happen or not, or will an attack lead to stability. You don't believe that a military attack on Iran will lead quickly to stability. We haven't had good examples of that. This idea of a coup, I want to put everybody's mind at rest a little bit about it. I've heard it too, like, will someone rise within the IRGC ranks and overthrow Khamenei? I mean, again, that's a very Western conception of political systems, which doesn't resonate with the Iranians. I don't think that people who talk understand the complexity. You do, of course, but not everybody. Would it be a pseudo coup like the one in Venezuela, where the vice president who served under Maduro is still serving as head of state? More like it, an IRGC guy with 2 daughters here in San Francisco, for example, studying at the city, or I don't know, wherever they want. So we have to be a little more real about that. I want to go back to the question of enduring. We have about maybe 3 more minutes. We're dealing with a heavily ideologically indoctrinated society. I don't think we appreciate how much religion matters to these people and their eventual outlook on the world. We're also looking at a state that is a Shia state. So as a minority, it feels encircled by the Sunni majority in the region, who are all pro-American, by the Jewish state, which it does not recognize because it believes its problem is not with Israel, Dalia, if I may say, but with the fact that the end of the world in their mind is supposed to happen somewhere near the borders of Israel. And they want to expedite the end of the world. It's a religious indoctrination within Islam and more so within Shia Islam. And here we are protecting Israel. We do not have a religiously indoctrinated state, but surely ideology leads our foreign policy at some level. Tell us about that.
I'm sorry, I'm just not getting the question.
In Washington, D.C., what is the American ideology? We just say the Iranians have the ideology. I have an ideology. Yeah. What is it?
Well, I actually, I'm not sure there is. I think we don't, different, I think over time there's different framings, and I think that can change. That's why I'm, less pessimistic about the enduring part, because I think it could change. But there are people who argue that the U.S. ideology is so deeply wedded to expansionism, which right now sounds like, okay, yeah, maybe. And that, we're superior and that, this kind of thing. But I think you see a lot of exceptions. I think President Obama did not follow that. I think, you see all of this interest in the restraint camp, this America First, which is not just Trump. It started even in Obama. We need to pivot to Asia. We need to stop overextending. There was so much exhaustion from Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think there's been course correction. So I think that idea that there's one explanation, whether it's ideology, whether it's, one particular individual, I think there's no kind of silver bullet answer. It's very complicated. So I think I look at the domestic politics as a big part of the explanation, but that's fluid and it can change. And I think that, this idea that we have a wedded ideology, an American ideology that will prevent anything from changing, I'm not sure. I'm definitely not arguing that in this book, if that's what it came across to you.
Back to the question of Israel then.
Oh, Israel.
How much influence does Israel have over this ideology or lack of ideology conception in the United States?
Well, I actually deal with Israel in every chapter of the book because they do play the largest role in influencing U.S. policy in the Middle East in general, and including on Iran. And I do make the case that, yes, they had influence, but at the end of the day, the policy on Iran is homegrown. It's not coming from, and you see many instances from starting in the 80s, when actually the Israelis were focused on Iraq, not Iran. They thought that the U.S. was making a mistake by supporting the Iraqis, the Iranians. In fact, the Israelis were the one who cooked up the idea of selling arms to the Iranians. So the Israelis can be very pragmatic when necessary. So can the Iranians, for that matter. And then, and then in 2003, they would, I talked to Richard Haas for this book too, and he said Israelis would often come up to him and say, there are two countries with an eye in the Middle East and you invaded the wrong one. So the Israelis didn't have, and at the end of the day, they had the biggest lobbying campaign you can imagine to try to derail Obama's Iran. I don't want to call it Obama. It was a U.S. deal. That was Trump's version. It was the Obama deal. But it was a international arms control agreement. It wasn't just a U.S. deal. We had multilateral support for this arms agreement. And Israelis put Prime Minister Netanyahu went behind Obama's back, spoke to the U.S. Congress, tried to derail, and it still went through. And when it came to Trump, he was pushing on an open door. Trump was fulfilling a campaign promise. He was going to get rid of the worst deal ever. Again, the Obamacare foreign policy. Whatever the Israelis did or did not do would not have changed his mind. So again, they play a big role. I talk about them, but it's too easy to get off the hook and say it's all about the Israelis. It's about us. It's about the way we have talked about Iran for nearly half a century. It's the way we have limited knowledge about Iran. It's the way we keep limiting our policy options, and we don't have a good theory of change. And right now, we need a good theory of change, because this current development within the country, what's happening with our war footing, is not sustainable. We've got to figure out a different way.
I'm very glad that your idea of a theory of change is taking root inside Iran. I'm very proud to see, as I'm sure we all are, the women of Iran rising, the workers of Iran rising, the people of Iran rising against oppression. The question is, and this will be something for all of us to contemplate, how will, Dalia, in one sentence, because I have a few things to say before we close in less than 2 minutes, how will we seize that moment of change in Iran?
I don't think it's up to us. I think it's going to be up to the Iranian people. And we should give it the best environment we can, which I think means not attacking the country, supporting people in the country. I just wrote an article talking about ways we can help Iranian people without bombing them. And we need to start thinking more creatively about that. We haven't put a lot of focus on people. We've put a lot of focus on leaders that we don't like because they are repressive and do these bad things. So let the Iranian people, because I think there is a really, I think there's a lot of momentum in the country. There's a lot of anger, a lot of smart people. Let's give them the most enabling environment we can, but ultimately it's not going to be up to us.
And so with those words, I want to thank Dalia Dasi-Kay, the author of Enduring Hostility, The Making of America's Iran Policy, for this very important conversation tonight. Following our program, Dr. Dasi-Kay will be available for a book signing, and I encourage you to get the book. I've read it. It's great. And for more information about membership or upcoming Commonwealth Club World Affairs programs, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Banafsheh Keynoush. And thank you very much. And before I say good evening, one last observation. Should we install a new leader in Iran, or let them decide who they want to have as a leader?
I vote for let them decide.
Thank you all.